Hello, welcome. And my last session with you guys today. So in some ways we'll be referring back to a lot of the discussions we've been having. What I wanted to do was to give you some understanding of how I write. And the reason I thought that's a good idea is because often as students of literature, we engage with texts that are already completed. So we get a book, we get a short story, and it's all sort of done and dusted. There is also an instinct to then say, for example, maybe this is autobiographical. But what do we actually mean when we say that? And do we mean that this is autobiographical in the sense that somebody lived it? Is it that kind of a literalist sense? Or do we actually mean it in a larger way, based on some of the discussions we've had, who we identify as, where we are located socially, economically, politically, all of those things, right? And also, in some ways, to explain or talk about how all these different elements go into creating a book. Now, often, it's ipso facto. You kind of realize it when you're looking backwards, that all of these things are important, even though at the time, perhaps, you went through it without considering. So I'm going to sort of chart a little bit of a journey to Hotel Arcadia. And then the second half of it, for the lecture at least, I want to talk about how we receive literature and how, because you've been reading the book, how you receive, so we can have that discussion in the second half, but the fact that, people receive things differently, and the reader's role. So in a way, we're going back to the questions we started with. How do we interrogate our pleasure in reading, our pleasure in consuming culture, and all of those complicated, knotty questions. I mentioned right at the beginning that in some ways when I am writing, there is one author I go back to all the time, and that is Dante. Now, Dante is somebody I discovered as an undergrad. I took a module, one-term module, so it was, from January all the way to May, and it was only on the Divine Comedy. It was a final year module. And as somebody who is not from a Western tradition, it was quite an opaque, magical text. It's also a magical text because it includes imagery, it includes allusions that you could kind of go through line by line. And I still am completely fascinated because I know I don't understand most of it. But what really struck me was there was a kind of personal connection I felt. So I was reading this, and I really, we would go into lectures. And at some point, 4th or 5th class during the term, I suddenly went, I like this person. And it was a strange process because it wasn't the book. I connected with Dante Alighieri, the person, who lived 800 years ago and was very dead. And there's lots of things that I don't agree with him about. There are lots of things I vehemently disagree with. But there was something I really liked. And in some ways, it became a kind of challenge, but it also became an ongoing dialogue. So in my head, when I write, I'm writing back to this man that I really love his work, but who lived 800 years before me. And in my head, the dialogue continues. So I disagree with him, I will pick something up and go, maybe we should think about this another way. And strangely enough, a lot of my writing comes out of that. The good thing about it is that we've talked about how inspiration doesn't quite strike from the blue. You have to go looking for it. In a way, Dante's work has become my starting point. So when I'm in between writing, when I'm between projects, when I'm thinking about, when my mind is kind of fallow and looking for seeds to grow, I go back and read the Divine Comedy. And I go back and read it again and again and again. And this probably means I read at least parts of it once a year, if not more often. And each time I will pick something that will matter to me. Now, one of the stories that's always mattered to me is the idea of Paolo and Francesca. And the idea of it, this idea that you can be lovers, you can be sundered apart, and then punished eternally, to just be able to want each other but never be able to consummate that love, is an extraordinarily powerful idea. Now, Dante, of course, takes a very Christian view of it. You know, the couple is in hell, and they're in hell because they committed adultery. You know, the woman was married. That's it. There is no way around it. Now, I come from a tradition where it's, most Indic traditions don't actually have a concept of sin. Not in Hinduism, not in Jainism, not in, you can transgress. But there isn't really sin in the same Semitic way. Where somebody says, that's it, you're gone. End of story, there's no coming back from that. So that, of course, bothered me. I was like, well, hang on. But they meant well. And that meant well is also a cultural idea. Because in my tradition, it is the motivation that matters, not the act itself. So often, unlike the Ten Commandments, where it says, thou shalt not kill, the Bhagavad Gita says, if you do kill, then make sure it is without fear, without rage, it is for the right reasons. Now, that's a very different way of looking at something, right? So here I am, I'm like, I don't agree with these two people being punished for something they did. I don't agree with these two people being punished for eternity with being in hell. But that was my first reaction. That was the reaction I had when I was 20 years old. And as I kept going back, I kept thinking about it. And each time I would read the story and go, and somewhere I started to think that we live in an environment of instant gratification. We live in an environment where the idea of great love has almost died. We live in an environment where the idea that you can actually love somebody so much that you are willing to risk an eternity of damnation is almost unimaginable. So I went back to it and I actually said, this is the most deeply romantic story for our times. And somewhere in that process, my idea of reading the story shifted in those, the years. It went from looking at it going, this is deeply unfair, to going, maybe this is the perfect thing. Maybe you want the idea that two people will want each other and love each other forever is not such a bad idea. But it also made me go back to think about the way we look at love stories. And even when we look at things like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, it's quite funny because it's all about the adventures, the difficulties, till we get to that first kiss. That's really where it ends, right? Then we get, they lived happily ever after. You don't really want to go talk about how they lived happily ever after. And I kind of went, well, actually, this is truly the love story. Because the love story is not the consummation. The love story is the yearning. The love story is wanting. So I kind of went back to looking at that again. That was one stream that was going through, and it's a part that really, for me, is the sentimental part. Then there were other things that were happening. I used to live in Latin America in the 90s, and in Peru, Shining Path were the big people who were going around bombing things and killing people and all sorts of other things. And there was a hotel we used to stay at. It wasn't a particularly posh hotel. It was just a small, local hotel. And one day it was bombed. Now, what happened was quite strange because the bomb was left at reception, which was actually tiny. So the two people who were killed was the receptionist and one of the bellboys. And I remember feeling this awful sense of rage, saying, how can you tell us, how can you say you are fighting for the people that you are going around and killing? These were the poorest of the poor. They were there holding down jobs. And I remember this complete visceral anger. And I didn't know how to process it, so I parked it. I was like, I'll come back. I know this is important. I'll come back to it. And then I started covering things. I look at a lot of political issues. I look at a lot of terrorism, for example. I write about it. I write about armed conflict, both state and non-state. So I kept sort of going back and forth. And somewhere I was working on my PhD thesis, and I was going a little bit crazy. This idea came to me. So I had gone back to reading Dante, and I thought of a hotel. And the two ideas came together. So I was like, there's a hotel that I really am feeling visceral rage on. Lots of things have happened. 9/11 has happened. Afghanistan has been attacked. And, people, we don't even count the dead in Afghanistan. Iraq has been attacked. We're not even counting the dead there. We're just kind of like, oh, we're being there, we're liberating them. And so all of this kind of started coming back. And then the two bits came together. They came together in this hotel, which in my mind, strangely enough, was a version of Dante's Hell. So I drew up these architectural plans. I had notebooks with all these complicated things of all the different floors and what would happen in them. And in some ways, Abby, who's in sort of what is pretty much the bottom of this hotel, is where Judas is. And if you know the mythology, if you know the text, Judas betrays. That's why he's at the bottom of it. He is closest to Satan. And yet Judas betrays Christ because he's asked to betray Christ. And he's asked by none other than Christ himself. It is the worst choice possible. And I kind of went, okay, in this place, I will place my hero. What I consider the moral core of this book, Abby. I will place him where Satan resides. I will place him with Judas. And then we'll see what happens. And then all the other things started to come into place. It also meant that the only person who walks up and down is Sam, and in some ways becomes a Virgil-like character who goes up and down. Now this is a very strange process, right? Because it is an intellectual process that's happening. Of course, at the same time, there's all the other politics that are coming in for me. The politics of photography. There are two pieces I've recommended, and you'll find in the folder later on. John Berger's Photographs of Agni, which is I believe a 1972 essay, and Susan Sontag's book on photography. Now, these were both things I read as an undergrad, and these are both things I go back to constantly and looking at it and going, these are ideas I haven't quite gotten to yet. And in some ways, when I was looking at it, because I wasn't writing Dante's Inferno, I was writing a modern, contemporary work. It really struck me how we use photographs. Whose photographs are we willing to see? Whose photographs are we willing to hide? Which photographs, which bodies are acceptable on the front page of Daily Mail as a dead kid? And which bodies get the respect? So all of that that sort of thinking about it was happening. And part of that came to a very simple thing, and this is my starting point. I come from a background where people like me don't write books. I come from a background where women like me don't really go off and do creative things. So I've always stood from this kind of oppositional outsider perspective. And when I was looking at these photographs, when I was thinking about these photographs, I was looking at all these ideas, I also started looking at, as I said, who gets represented. And in the meantime, of course, 9/11 had happened, 7/7 had happened, the Madrid bombings had happened, the many, many dead in Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia and Sudan had happened. And all of this was happening, and I remember going, whose stories are we being told? And the first thing that struck me was, do you know what? There are not a whole lot of stories. The heroes, the bad guys, we get a certain image. but more importantly, the heroes get to be very, very specific. So we never see human interest stories in the newspaper about, for example, women of color who survived an attack. We never want to talk about, here's a woman in a hijab, and she survived this attack, and she's got a family, and she's got kids, and she's married, and she's, we never hear that. We never hear about women who are less than pretty. They never make it to the front page of the Telegraph. They have to be young, they have to be beautiful, and then it's okay if they survive an attack. Right? If they die, then you get the wedding photograph or a honeymoon photograph, them looking so lovely and so happy. And I went, hang on. They can't be possibly the only people who are dying in these places, in these attacks. So I started going back and looking at it. And one of the things that struck me most starkly was how after 9/11, even in that fog of horror and shock and disgust and terror, people who died, who didn't fit that not nice mold, they were removed. So we didn't see them. We didn't see the Latin Americans. We didn't see the Guatemalans, the Dominicans, the Mexicans. We didn't see the many, many, many Haitians. We didn't see the many Middle Eastern people. We never got to see any of those people who we thought were the appropriate victims, and therefore who we thought were the right kind of heroes was decided for us even there. And it wasn't just the women. It was also, I was watching this and going, hang on. How come every single guy who gets to be a hero also gets to be straight? He's a great father. He's a great son. He's a great husband. He was my lovely boyfriend. Really? You're telling me nobody else? No, there is no gay person who goes into the army, for example, which is the ultimate, most homoerotic, non-heteronormative institution that exists. Really? You're telling me there are no heroes who can be anything but straight? And in that sense, that kind of got involved as well with the book, in that process. So I was thinking about it. And all of this stuff was churning in my head. I was reading, I was doing my research, I was looking through every photograph that existed. I looked up every single war photographer that existed. And somewhere from this, and you talked about this moment of pure creation, there was a strange process. All this information started to coalesce into two personalities. I knew there was Abby, who was back at the base of this hotel, who was at the center of hell, if you want to call it. And there was Sam. And they came to me in some ways as coalesced beings, because I had been doing so much work. And of course there was a glimmer. They weren't complete characters. So then I went back and did all the, if you've sat in my creative writing classes, you've done all these exercises. Then I went back to create them as full characters. And then that's a technical process. I'll tell you something really funny that happened though. Because I had so much stuff happening in my head, and I had this notebook, and I had architectural plans of the hotel, I had huge complicated plot lines, I had lots of things that kind of were going on, I had these character exercises that went on for pages and pages and pages, and I was hanging on to this notebook, and it was a physical notebook. It wasn't actually, sort of something that you type on. And I would be making notes frantically. And I had about 15,000 words, which is the first this much of the novel. It's about 80,000 words. And I'd gotten stuck. And had this massive writer's block. And I couldn't write. I was just walking around like months. This kept going. And I was like, if I don't write this, I'm going to start teaching again. And I will have no time to write. So come on, get this done. And I would get up in the morning, nothing. Go for a long walk, nothing. Make more notes. And then there was a really strange moment. I was coming back from a literary event And it was about writer's block, funnily enough. And I was on the tube. And at one point I had to change, and it was Earl's Court. I had to change the line from one to the other. And when I got to the second tube, I didn't have my notebook. And I just went, this is it. This is 3 years of work just gone completely down the tube, complete panic. Sort of, when should I get back? Do I not? I had this 10 minutes of trying to get back in and out, and then going, where am I going to look for this? It's a ratty notebook. I can't even ask anybody for it. Right? And it would make no sense to anyone. Because, of course, as a writer, you then have this complete panic attack. Not only that it's lost, but, oh my God, what if somebody finds it and writes it for me? And then I was like, well, hang on, nobody can make sense of this. It means nothing to anyone except me. And my mind's a scary place, so nobody will actually look at it and go. And I actually said, you know what, I'm going to calm down, I'm going to go home, and I'm not going to think about it. And I did exactly that. I went home, I went to bed, and at 5 o'clock the next morning, I woke up absolutely, completely in this frenzy. And I wrote from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock, got dressed, came, taught, had to tell my third years that if I make no sense, please just stop and tell me, because I have no idea what I'm talking about right now. Obviously, they said it still made sense, so that was good. And I was on autopilot for the next month. And I was writing sometimes 8-10 hours a day. I was on my computer just hammering it out. You can say, in that sense, it's a sort of a Shelley, Keats, romantic idea of creating in a frenzy and this grand fervor. But actually it wasn't. Because all it was, that it was on my head, and I needed to get it out. So the rest of the first draft happened in about a month. And I kind of just finished it, put it aside, and sent it to my agent, who went, wow, this is really good. You have to change stuff, but this is really good. Which, by the way, is the most you can expect if you've ever done a first draft. And then, of course, I spent the next about 18 months editing and polishing and cleaning and just going back and redoing it. And there would be a lot of things that would then come up. The process of that editing and polishing is never entirely alone. So normally I will do X amount, and each time it goes to my agent, and then she'll pick it up, and it reaches a certain stage, and then she starts to send it out. Now, ideally what happens is the last bit of editing happens with an editor at a publishing house. This book had a strange process again, because it was being translated into Dutch to coincide with the English publication date, because they read, the country reads in both languages, and often it's quicker, and it actually sells better if it is in Dutch, rather than bringing it out a few months later when everybody's read it in English already. So they decided they were going to coincide the same dates, which meant it was being translated well before the editors of my British publishing house had gotten to it. So they were like, yeah, we'll get to it. Meanwhile, this is somebody who's sitting in Holland madly translating it. But what also started happening is, because she was looking at it so closely, she would send me these sheets of questions going, how does this make sense? And is this timeline logical? And you said this on page 25. Does this matter to page 113? And it was what an editor would do. But the strange thing was, of course, it was happening from a translator. Right? So it was a very weird kind of a way of going forward. But interestingly, I think it did something really, really quite special. Because she was translating into a language that is far more constrained than English, she was actually flagging up things that an English language editor may not have picked up. Because she was translating structurally as well as just by line, she was picking up things that perhaps an English language editor would never have picked up. So things like, what exactly is the timeline, and is it morning, is it, so I knew that it was 67 hours, so I'd worked that out, but there were inconsistencies, because, you've written all the stuff, and so you've forgotten that maybe 4 hours ago it would have been dark already, and so you haven't quite picked it up. But because there was somebody who was working so closely with it, it became a kind of process that perhaps would not have happened with an English language editor. So at the end of it, each time she would ask me a question, I would make the changes on my draft, and we would wait for it. And then finally, the draft was delivered to my publishers with a Dutch edit, if you want to call it that way. And it was pretty much all they had to then do was to just proofread it, because it had gone through this entire process. Now, it's a very strange way of going forward, but the reason I flag it up is because there isn't one way that books come out, especially in a globalized world. A very strange process had happened with my last book, my last novel, where the first edition, which is the first place it's printed and published and so on, the first edition of my last novel is actually in Spanish, even though it's been written in English. Why? I wrote it in English, went off to publishers, and my Spanish publisher wanted to bring it out about 8 months before everyone else. So they proceeded to race through the translation, race through the editing, they did everything, and bam, it hit the market before the actual original hit the market. So I write in English. It was another 8-9 months after, till the English version came out. So it's very funny, because I always go, well, yes, if you really want a first edition, you'll have to buy the Spanish one, because that's how it works. But it's actually quite interesting how that globalized environment now works. Partly because we're used to thinking only in one language, and we're only used to we're thinking in one territory, one country. And then actually some of us who cut across these lines, we end up working in multiple spaces at the same time. And I guess that, for me, is a fascinating way of looking at how this plays out. But I think, for me, it's also because all of the elements of that globalized world that feed into my writing and my fiction, it's appropriate, then, that they also show up in the actual physicality of those books. Just pull that up again, just partly because I need to just make sure I don't overshoot my time. Good. We're doing okay. The second part of it, and I guess this is where I want to open up the discussion for later on, or the second half of this session, is the idea of reception. As I said, strange process. I write in English, and it's published. Sometimes it's published at the same time. Sometimes it's published in a different language before it's published in English. It's also strange things. For example, I'm from India, but this book has no Indian publisher. So strange of what is and what is not acceptable, or what is not desirable around the world changes and switches. And there isn't a clear answer. What will make it work? You can have a book that sort of, you're like, well, that will get us into trouble, and it won't. It's a little bit of what you guys said. Remember last week with the Rushdie affair. You have no idea what will set things off. You have no idea when you write a book that it will get people upset, or it will get people excited, or people will like it. All you can do, and in that sense, that's where I start from. All I can do is to write the book I want to read. And I think, for me, that's the crucial point. Often, we consume culture, so we're like, yeah, okay, and so even when we're uncomfortable, we're like, maybe it's just me. Maybe, I don't see myself in a book, or I don't see the kinds of issues I want addressed in a movie, but I'll just pretend they'll go away. And for me, it's always been like, well, I want to see myself being able to read books that I want to read, It's not that I need to see myself in the book. I need to have books talk about things that are important to me. So when I was a kid, I used to actually read books, and then I would have notebooks where I would rewrite them. Because I was like, well, do you know what? Yes, I know Great Expectations is a great story, but frankly, let's redo it. From my perspective, with people who are a little bit more interesting. So, what did this man do when he was away over there in Australia, for example? Yeah, those are kind of questions that would happen for me. So for me, I will always write the books that I want to read, that I feel that the stories that aren't being told, and I would love to hear those stories and read those stories, that's what I write. Now, how that is received in the market, as in publishers, critics, reviewers, isn't something I can't control. However, what has happened is, because of technology, because of globalization, there's an enormous number of readers who may not be in the same countries, who may not even speak the same language, who are interested in the same sort of issues. So there's an enormous number of people who are also going, yeah, I'd like to hear more about this. And this is a story that matters, and I'm not seeing it. So there is a sense that, I have a readership that cuts across borders, it cuts across languages, it cuts across geographical locations. And that's actually quite fortunate, because I think if I were writing if I wrote the same book 20 years ago, there would be no space for it, because there would be no way of making it available to people. There would be no way of saying, hey, this is interesting. There would be no way for someone in the Congo or in Egypt or in Bahrain to download it from Amazon and say, which, by the way, is another set of things, because you then have to, in some countries, have to kind of rework how you're going to use your net and kind of fool both corporates and governments in order to access things. But the fact is, it's possible, right? Which would not have been possible 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So that's one part of the reception. But the second part of it is a little bit, as I was saying, I used to rewrite the books. So I would rewrite Great Expectations, my plot lines going, that's what I want to read. Is also an insight of how we read and how we receive culture and how we consume culture. There is always, and in my mind, there's a loop that is begun by the author, as in this case, me, and it closes with the reader. And that means that there's a whole lot of people who are involved. Now, what that means is, when I read Dante 20 years ago, or more than that, at university, and suddenly felt that link and said, if we lived in the same time and place, we would probably be friends. In reality, we probably wouldn't be friends, because we'd be at each other's throats all the time. But there is the sense that, this is somebody who speaks to me. So there's a conversation that's already begun. When I read John Berger, when I read Sontag, when I read all these people, that conversation's already happening in my head with earlier writers. So in some ways, I'm receiving that information, and as a reader, I'm closing the loop for myself, for that text. So when I read The Divine Comedy, or I read on photography, there are ideas that are contained in that text that the author had, and I close the loop. But it's almost anachronistic, or it's somehow inappropriate to call it a loop, because a loop suggests that it closes and it stays completely sealed. In some ways, it's a spiral, in the sense it's an ongoing thing. So I receive it. I receive a text, I read it, I think about it, I critically engage with it, I emotionally engage with it, I kind of go, this is important, this is not important. And then somewhere, I react to it. I can react to it, in my case, because I'm a writer, I react to it creatively. So I respond by writing back to Dante, for example. I respond by writing back to Sontag. Or, and it's not necessarily, writing back has the sense of almost a confrontation. But it isn't a confrontation. It is about a debate. It's about saying, you said this, and this is my view of it. And that is part of the creative process. But as readers and as students of literature, we do that anyway. Because we're reacting to things we read intellectually and, if you want to call it emotionally or creatively, because we're actually saying, you know what, this book matters to me. If we weren't reacting to it, we wouldn't get so upset when somebody criticizes, I don't know, for example, Harry Potter. And you're like, I love that book. How dare you say something terrible about it? How dare you criticize it, right? So that kind of an emotional link is there. But if you want to think about studying literature or reacting to literature in that sense of interrogating our pleasures, interrogating our spaces, then that reaction is also going to be critical. It's going to sort of go, think about it, think about being at a date or think about being at a party and you meet somebody new and they're like, well, I think red is great. And you're like, thank you. I love the fact you love red. This is all I've got to say to you. That conversation wouldn't get very far, would it? So, when they say, well, yeah, I think red is great. And you're like, well, it sort of annoys me a little bit when I see too much of it. And then suddenly you might have an opening to have a conversation beyond going, oh, it's so wonderful. And I think that's where the idea of critical reactions comes from, of interrogating our pleasures, because you can't engage in a debate, which is entirely, or even a discussion, or even a conversation, unless we're willing to be critical, unless we're willing to question it. Having said that, there is no one authorized, valid critique. There is no one valid reaction. I'm fascinated as a writer when people react to my books, right, and react to things. And often it is far more about the reader and who they are than it is about me. In a different way, the person, the student, the undergrad who read Divine Comedy and just went, wow, this is amazing, as an undergrad, is not the same reader of that same text today. I have changed. So my reaction to it is different. That reading process is different. And that's not because the text has changed. It's because I have changed. And in a way, we do this all the time. So I have readers who will pick up things from a book, from my book, and it will throw me because I'll be like, really? So, for example, I was in Amsterdam early in the year doing some promotion work for the book, for the Dutch edition. And at one of the events, there was a gentleman, and he was, he heard it, he asked a few questions, and I could see he was really agitated. He was really upset about something. And he was really angry about the book somehow. And I'm okay with people being angry about books, because that's a good thing. If you've read it and it makes you upset, good, because that's a reaction. But throughout this evening, he would come back to me, and he would ask me a question about cameras. If you've read the book, there's an awful lot of cameras mentioned in there. And he would be like, so in this point, why did you use this camera? Why does she use this? And they were really kind of technical questions, nitty-gritty questions. And I would answer it. And then he'd go off. And then about 10 minutes later, another glass of wine, he'd be back, and he'd be back in that. And then it kept going over and over again. And about 6-7 questions later, I was like, are you a photographer? He's like, no, but I'm interested in photography. And we started talking, and he said, it really disturbs me. It disturbs me that, you've talked about photography this way. And we had a very interesting conversation that then came about the book. But in some ways, his starting premise was that if he could somehow catch me out in a technical detail, then he could park that entire discussion. He could say, she doesn't know anything about it. So I don't have to, own my discomfort. And I think that's for me, it was an insightful moment. in some ways, because we've been talking about that in the last few weeks, right? Things will make you uncomfortable. Do you sort of go, park it, let's not think about it? Or do you own the discomfort and say, we'll move on, I'll react, I'll ask myself why it's making me uncomfortable. What is it that bothers me? And there isn't going to be a completely clean answer, and it'll be a very different answer for every one of us. And I want to emphasize that that is actually a good thing, that we take a multi-layered, textured, nuanced text will open itself up for people to see parts of it and own parts of it. And that's, in a sense, what makes good writing what it is, because it allows itself to be interpreted and reinterpreted and owned in different ways by each individual who brings themselves to it. I wanted to end, actually, with two things. And they're linked to this, partly because one of the things I love is how people react. So readers are great. Readers are really interesting. But one of the things is how, in some ways, other creatives react and what they bring to the book, to any text, right? So at the start, when the book came out, we did 2 book trailers for it. And the 2 book trailers were very different because they were handed to 2 people, 2 sets of filmmakers, very, very different locations, very, very different people, who reacted to the book in whichever way they wanted. Right? So it was quite a free brief. You could do whatever you want. Both of the sets are people I know. So the first set of people, Sandy and Will, actually graduated from our program. They both go up. Sandy's a script writer, and he's the best job title in the world. He's a flirting consultant. When scripts want people to oomph it up when they're flirting, they call Sandy in. It's a brilliant way of doing it. Brilliant way to make money, by the way. What a great job. And Will is a filmmaker, and they make films together and do things. So they did one trailer. And the other trailer was by an African feminist filmmaker, journalist, who has covered a lot of stuff in Uganda and the Congo and brought a completely different sensibility to it. And for me, I would like to share, just so that we can then think about how people react, both critically and creatively, to other pieces of writing or other films and so on, just so that maybe perhaps you can think about how it plays.